I'm going to tell you a story about how I ended up here, alive, mostly sane, and definitely smelling faintly of dog treats at all times. But to understand the miracle, you have to understand the mess I was first. You see, for 20 years, I was Frank Miller, Major Miller, a guy who knew exactly where his boundaries were, where the enemy was, and where his next objective lay. I was trained to operate under extreme pressure, to make life or death decisions in the blink of an eye, and most importantly, I was trained to survive. Then came the retirement. They give you a plaque, handshake, and they send you home. And suddenly all that training, it's useless. The boundaries vanish. The enemy isn't outside anymore. He's sitting right there on your couch, wearing your face. When I first moved into that little house outside of Bozeman, Montana, the one I bought specifically because it was far enough from everything that nobody would bother me, I thought isolation was the cure. I craved silence. Absolute, it's silence. Because silence meant safety. Every sudden noise, every unexpected knock, every siren cutting through the air was a tripwire. My heart rate would rocket up to 150, and I'd be scanning the windows, looking for the threat that wasn't there. I spent 3 years living like a ghost. My routine was simple: wake up before dawn. Do 100 push-ups just because the habit was too deeply ingrained to stop. Drink black coffee. Watch the news with the volume muted because voices were too jarring. Eat canned chili because cooking was too complicated. And then I'd sit. I just sit. Sometimes I'd try to read, but the words would swim. Mostly, I just stare at the wall, wishing the clock would move faster so I could go back to sleep, because sleep was the only time the flashbacks couldn't get me. I only left the house for 2 things: groceries, which I bought at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the mandatory check-ins with the VA, which I considered a form of sanctioned torture. My sister, Sarah, bless her persistent heart, was the only lifeline I hadn't managed to cut entirely. She lived down in Missoula, and she'd call every Sunday at 4:00 p.m. sharp. If I didn't answer by the 3rd ring, she'd start calling the local sheriff. I usually answered on the 2nd. "Frank, how are you?" she'd ask, her voice always too bright, trying to pull me out of the swamp. "I'm fine, Sarah. The roof hasn't collapsed. The food supply is stable." "Have you left the house this week?" Define left the house. Walked outside the perimeter, Frank. Felt the sun. I'd sigh. "It was overcast, Sarah." And no, I haven't. She tried to push me, argue with me, but eventually she'd just sigh herself. She knew I was circling the drain, but she didn't know how to grab hold. And honestly, I was tired of fighting. I was tired of being jumpy, tired of the nightmares, tired of feeling like a defective machine that couldn't be repaired. I was ready to just stop. Just let go of the rope and sink. The turning point, or maybe the shove off the cliff, depending on how you look at it, came in October. Sarah had badgered me into a special appointment at the VA clinic in Helena. It wasn't just the usual check-in, it was with a new therapist, Dr. Jen, who specialized in severe isolation cases. I sat in that sterile room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a sound that was driving me insane, and I was wearing my armor. Closed off. 1-word answers. Deflection. Dr. Chen was smart. He didn't try to break the wall down, he just walked around it. "Major Miller," he said, leaning forward, his voice calm. "Your physical health is excellent considering your age and history. But your file shows 0 community engagement, 0 social interaction, and significant reports of hypervigilance and avoidance behaviors." I shrugged. "Seems accurate. You are isolating yourself to the point of self-harm, Frank. You need a tether, something to pull you back into the rhythm of life." I looked him dead in the eye. "I had a rhythm for 20 years, doctor. It was called Don't Die Today. And I'm finding the civilian rhythm highly overrated." He nodded, not fazed. "I understand the skepticism, but we need to explore options. Have you considered an emotional support animal?" I actually laughed. It was a rusty, unused sound that startled me. "A bet. Doc, I can barely take care of myself. I'm certainly not going to be responsible for some living creature that needs feeding, walking, and, God forbid, affection. It's not about affection, Frank. It's about routine. It's about unconditional demand. An animal forces you to be present. It forces you to look outside your own head." I shook my head firmly. "Absolutely not. If I wanted noise and chaos, I'd move back to Kabul." Next idea. The session ended, of course, with nothing resolved. But Sarah was waiting for me outside. She didn't say a word about the appointment, which was usually her opening move. Instead, she just got into the driver's seat of my beat-up Ford F-150 and started the engine. "Where are we going?" I asked, instantly suspicious. "Just need to run an errand," she said, pulling out of the parking lot. We drove for about 20 minutes, and I watched the familiar Montana landscape drift by big sky, rolling hills, the beginnings of the mountains. Then she pulled into the parking lot of a place called Big Sky Animal Rescue and Adoption Center. My stomach dropped. "Sarah, I told Dr. Jen no. I told you no." She put the truck in park and turned off the engine, her face serious. "Frank, you are dying in that house. You're not living, you're waiting to expire. I can't watch it anymore. We're just going to look. No pressure. If you hate every single animal in there, we leave. Deal?" I didn't want to deal. I wanted to crawl back into my cave. But Sarah's eyes were glistening, and I knew if I caused a scene, she'd cry, and that was one emotional blast radius I couldn't handle. "Fine," I grumbled, slamming the truck door shut. 10 minutes. And nothing with sharp teeth. The moment we walked inside, my senses were overloaded. The noise. Barking, whining, the smell of disinfectant and wet dog hair, and the chaotic energy of volunteers bustling around. It was the complete opposite of the structured, predictable environment I needed to function. I immediately retreated, pressing myself against the wall, trying to make myself smaller. Sarah grabbed my arm and dragged me past the cages of the big dogs. I saw labs, huskies, and a massive German shepherd that looked like it was bred for military work. My mind instantly went into professional assessment mode. Good working drive, high energy, needs intense training, would make an excellent perimeter guard. "No big dogs, Frank," Sarah said, reading my mind. "They require too much physical activity right now. We're looking for a low-impact distraction." She led me to a quieter section near the back, where the smaller, older, or less popular dogs were housed. It was here, in a run marked short snouts and snorts, that I first laid eyes on Tank. He wasn't impressive. Not in the slightest. He was a Pibble Dog. Built like a miniature tank, I guess the name fit, and mostly white with big, patchy brown spots like someone had spilled coffee on a marshmallow. He had massive bat-like ears and a face that looked permanently grumpy, yet somehow ridiculous. He was sound asleep in the middle of his kennel, sprawled out on his back, legs splayed open in a position of complete, unearned confidence. And he was making a noise. A truly awful, mechanical noise that sounded like a clogged vacuum cleaner trying to suck up gravel. "Oh God," I muttered, staring at him. "What is that sound?" "That, Frank, is Tank," said a woman who appeared beside us. She was a volunteer, maybe in her 60s, wearing a t-shirt that said "Rescue Mom." She had kind eyes and a knowing smile. "He's snoring," Sarah whispered, giggling. "He's not snoring," I corrected her. "He's suffocating slowly. That thing needs an emergency tracheotomy." The volunteer, Martha, chuckled softly. "That's just Tank. He's a snorter and a snuffer. He's built for maximum noise and minimum athletic performance. He's been here 3 months. Nobody wants him." I looked closer. He was definitely overweight. His face was pushed in so far he barely had a nose. He was the antithesis of the disciplined, powerful dogs I respected. He was a biological joke. Martha knelt down and tapped gently on the wire mesh. "Tank. Visitors." Tank didn't move. He just let out an extra loud, wet snort that sounded like a cartoon pig clearing its sinuses. "See?" I told Sarah. "Low maintenance. He's already perfected the art of non-existence. He's perfect for me." I meant it sarcastically. But then Tank stirred. Slowly, agonizingly, he rolled onto his side, blinking his massive, dark eyes at us. He let out a little grunt, pulled himself onto 4 stubby legs, and waddled over to the front of the kennel. He looked up at me. And I mean right up at me. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated, dopey curiosity. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't demanding. He just looked like he was constantly confused about where his next meal was coming from. Then he did it. He leaned his entire body against the wire, let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak, a noise that definitely didn't belong to his bulky frame, and then, without warning, he passed gas. It wasn't a subtle thing. It was immediate, potent, and smelled exactly like we cold canned chili. Sarah choked, covering her mouth to stifle a laugh. Martha looked embarrassed. I, however, just stared at the dog. All my tension, my hypervigilance, my carefully constructed emotional fortress, it just paused. I was so taken aback by the sheer audacity of this small creature's flatulence that for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about IEDs or close air support. I was thinking, did that dog just ruin my perfectly fine isolation with a biological weapon? Well, Martha said quickly, fanning the air. He's enthusiastic. Enthusiastic is an understatement, I said, shaking my head. I looked at Sarah, who was wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. This is your low-impact distraction. This is a biohazard. He needs you, Frank, Martha intervened, her voice suddenly serious. She must have sensed my slight break in composure. He's a sweetheart, but he's high maintenance in his own weird way. He needs a rigid schedule for feeding, he needs medication for his skin allergies, and he has zero sense of self-preservation. He's a challenge. And Frank, you look like a man who needs a challenge that doesn't involve wearing body armor. That hit me harder than she knew. She saw the soldier beneath the ghost. I looked back at Tank. He was still pressed against the wire, gazing at me with those big, moist eyes. He let out another soft grunt and then, with a massive effort that seemed to strain his entire spine, he lifted one paw and gently tapped the mesh. A plea. A request. A demand. He's asking for belly rubs, Major, Martha murmured. He's asking for immediate termination, I corrected, but my voice lacked conviction. Sarah stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Just take him home for a week, Frank. If you hate him, I'll take him. But please, just try. He's ridiculous. He's chaos. He's the opposite of everything you've built here. Maybe that's what you need. I thought about my silent house. My dark routine. My desperate need for nothingness. And then I thought about that noxious cloud of gas and the ridiculous face that produced it. The silence in my life was killing me. Maybe a little loud, stinky chaos wouldn't be the end of the world. Maybe it would just be the end of that world. I didn't say yes. I just gave a defeated sigh. Does he come with a gas mask for me? Martha beamed. Sarah let out a whoop of joy that made me jump slightly, but I managed not to flinch too badly. The adoption process was agonizingly slow. I had to fill out paperwork, answer questions about my living situation, which I lied about profusely, claiming I walked 5 miles a day, and listened to Martha lecture me on the specific dietary needs of a brachycephalic breed. Sarah paid the adoption fee and bought a mountain of supplies, a bright blue harness that clashed terribly with Tank's patchy fur, a bag of expensive kibble, and a squeaky toy shaped like a rubber chicken. When it was finally time to go, Martha fitted Tank with the harness. The dog looked absolutely thrilled. He was bouncing slightly on his short legs, making little puffing sounds. He looked like a bowling ball with 4 springs. Remember, Frank, Martha said, handing me the leash. He's not a service dog. He's not a therapy dog. He's just Tank. He's a companion who demands attention, and he will not be ignored. I took the leash, the leather heavy and unfamiliar in my hand. It felt like I was holding a tether to a very unstable, flatulent bomb. Getting Tank into the truck was a fiasco. I opened the passenger door, expecting him to jump in. He didn't. He looked at the step, looked at me, and then whined pathetically. You're a dog, I said, exasperated. Jump. He just sat down and stared. I ended up having to scoop his dense body up. He felt heavier than he looked, pure, solid mass. He immediately started licking my chin, his tongue rough and oddly warm. Knock it off, soldier, I muttered, dropping him onto the seat. The ride home to Bozeman was a nightmare. First, Tank did not understand the concept of a seatbelt. He immediately tried to climb into my lap, which, given his density, was like having a small, hairy boulder shifting around my core. Stay, I commanded, reverting to my old training voice. He paused, looked at me for exactly 3 seconds, and then let out a defiant snort and tried to chew the plastic molding near the window. I pulled over. I had to physically restrain him in the passenger seat, using the center console as a barrier. He settled down eventually, but only after releasing another cloud of noxious gas. Then came the noise. He didn't just snore when he slept, he snorted when he was awake. Every breath was an audible event. It was a symphony of wheezing, clicking, and scraping sounds, punctuated by loud, wet snuffs. It was impossible to ignore. It was so distracting that I actually forgot to check my rearview mirror for imaginary threats. My focus was entirely consumed by the creature wheezing beside me. You are the loudest thing I have ever encountered that didn't require earplugs, Hank, I said, glaring at him. He just cocked his head and gave me a look that said yes. And, when we finally pulled up to my isolated little house, the late afternoon sun was hitting the porch just right. It looked exactly as it should, quiet, still, and empty. The perfect bunker. I opened the truck door and Tank, surprisingly, launched himself out with gusto. He hit the ground, took one look at the wide, open yard, and immediately started tearing across the lawn like a tiny, brown and white torpedo. "Tank! Heel!" I barked. He ignored me completely. He ran straight for the biggest pine tree, did a clumsy little circle, and then squatted to pee. I stood there, holding the leash that had slipped from my grasp, watching this absurd dog defile the sacred silence of my isolation. I felt a surge of genuine, fiery rage, not the cold, contained anger of PTSD, but the simple, human frustration of dealing with a profoundly stupid dog. "We are going to have rules, you little menace," I growled, stomping across the lawn to grab his leash. I managed to corral him and drag him toward the house. The moment I unlocked the door, he bolted inside. Now, my house was immaculate. Not because I was a good housekeeper, but because clutter created visual noise and I couldn't handle that. Everything was neat, sparse, and organized. Tank didn't care. He ran straight to the living room rug, a nice, neutral gray area rug, and proceeded to shake his body vigorously, covering the floor in a fine mist of shelter dust and dog hair. Then he found the rubber chicken toy Sarah had bought. He grabbed it, ran in a frantic circle, and then started mercilessly squeaking it. Thweek, thweek, thweek. The sound was maddening. It cut through the silence like a chainsaw. I stood in the doorway, my hands clenched, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was it. This was the end of my controlled environment. I walked over, leaned down, and snatched the toy from his mouth. "No," I said, holding it up. "We don't do that inside. We have quiet inside." Tank looked devastated. His bottom lip trembled slightly. He sat down and let out a soft, mournful whine that managed to sound both pathetic and manipulative. I tossed the toy onto the kitchen counter, far out of reach. "We are going to establish a new routine immediately," I announced, mostly to myself. "You will eat at 0700 and 1700. You will walk at 0800 and 1800. You will sleep in your crate." I went to the utility closet and dragged out the new crate Sarah had purchased. I set it up in the corner of the living room, threw a blanket inside, and pointed to it. "Crate, now." Tank didn't move. He just stared at the crate with suspicion, as if it were a trap designed by his enemies. I sighed. This was going to be harder than dealing with a platoon of raw recruits. At least recruits understood the chain of command. I spent the next 2 hours wrestling with Tank. I tried luring him with food. He ate the food and then refused to enter the crate. I tried physically placing him inside. He became a dead weight and snorted in protest. Finally, exhausted and defeated, I just gave up. I slumped onto the couch I rarely sat on, and rubbed my temples. Tank, sensing the cessation of hostilities, took this as an invitation. He waddled over, stood on his hind legs, and tried to climb up onto the couch beside me. He didn't jump. He clawed his way up, making a terrible scratching sound on the upholstery. "Get off," I commanded. He ignored me, finally hoisting his bulk onto the cushion. He didn't settle down beside me. Oh no. He walked straight across my lap, turned 3 times, and then flopped down, resting his massive, heavy head right on my thigh. I froze. Physical contact was something I avoided like the plague. I hated being touched, hated the vulnerability of it. If someone touched me without warning, my instinct was to fight or flee. But Tank wasn't aggressive. He was just heavy and warm. I sat rigid, counting to 10, waiting for the panic attack to hit. It didn't. The only thing that hit was the realization that this dog was truly unbelievably comfortable. He let out a deep, rumbling sigh, and then the snorting started again, louder now that his head was pressed against my leg. I couldn't move. If I moved, he would wake up and the chaos would resume. So I just sat there, trapped beneath 30 pounds of snoring, flat-faced dog. I stared out the window at the familiar, dark Montana night. For 3 years, this darkness had been my comfort. Now the darkness was still there, but it was filled with the sound of a Pibble Dog wheezing through his sleep. I stayed that way for maybe an hour, listening to the erratic rhythm of Tank's breathing. It wasn't the steady, predictable rhythm of a machine. It was wet, irregular, and thoroughly alive. As I sat there, pinned down, something strange happened. The usual mental noise, the constant internal chatter of threat assessment and trauma replay, it quieted down. It didn't vanish, but it was muffled, pushed aside by the immediate, simple reality of the dog on my lap. I was too busy calculating how long I could sit without needing the bathroom, and trying to ignore the subtle heat radiating off Tank's body, to worry about things that happened 10 years ago. When Tank finally stirred, he lifted his head, looked up at me with those dopey eyes, gave my thigh one quick, wet lick, and then gracefully slid off the couch, hitting the floor with a soft thump. He looked back at me, let out a soft whine, and then waddled toward the kitchen. I realized he needed water. And maybe to go outside again. The routine had begun. Not my routine. His. The first week was pure hell. I didn't sleep more than 3 consecutive hours. Tank demanded attention constantly. If I tried to sit and read, he would bring the rubber chicken and drop it repeatedly on my foot. Squeak, squeak, squeak. If I was in the kitchen, he would sit by the door and whine until I opened it. If I went into the bathroom, he would sit outside the door and snort loudly, ensuring I knew I was not truly alone. His eating schedule was precise, and if I was late by 5 minutes, he would stand by his bowl and give me a look of profound betrayal. His bathroom schedule was equally demanding, and because he was a Frenchie, he was slow. I had to stand outside in the crisp autumn air, waiting patiently, while he meticulously sniffed every blade of grass before deciding on the perfect spot. This was the first time I had been outside during daylight hours for anything other than a quick dash to the truck. I remember the first time a neighbor saw me. I was standing on the edge of my property, wearing my standard uniform of sweatpants and a decade-old army t-shirt, waiting for Tank to finish his business. Tank, meanwhile, was trying to eat a pine cone. A woman walked by, walking a very well-behaved golden retriever. She stopped. "Oh, hi," she called out, sounding cheerful and utterly foreign to my existence. "I haven't seen you around. Welcome to the neighborhood." Is that a Frenchie? My heart hammered. Interaction. Unscheduled. Threat level, orange. I forced myself to speak. "Yeah. This is Tank." Tank, hearing his name, immediately stopped chewing the pine cone and let out a loud, excited snort, followed by the inevitable puff of gas. The woman laughed. "Oh, they are characters, aren't they? I'm Susan. I live just up the road." I managed a tight nod. "Frank." "Well, Frank, Tank is adorable. Tell me, does he snore like a freight train?" Ours did. I actually found myself talking to her. Not about the war, not about my trauma, but about the mechanical breathing issues of a small, flat-faced dog. "He sounds like he's trying to swallow a golf ball," I admitted, and Susan laughed again. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes. It was awkward, exhausting, and completely insignificant. But when I went back inside, I felt different. I hadn't retreated. I hadn't panicked. I had engaged, and the world hadn't ended. Tank didn't allow me to hide the way I used to. If I tried to sink back into the couch and stare at the wall, he would demand a walk. If I refused the walk, he would start doing zoomies, short, frantic bursts of speed around the coffee table until I gave in. I started walking him twice a day, every day, rain or shine. I hated it. The cold air felt sharp, the sounds of birds and cars were too loud, and I hated being exposed. But I had to walk him. If I didn't, he would pee on the rug, and the sheer effort of cleaning up after him was worse than facing the Montana wilderness. We stuck to the quiet back roads at first. Me, a hulking, reluctant veteran, being led by a stubby, wheezing dog who looked like he was constantly struggling to maintain forward momentum. Slowly I started noticing things again. The specific, sharp smell of pine needles after a rain. The way the light hit the peaks of the mountains in the early morning. I noticed that my boots were starting to get muddy, and I wasn't obsessing over cleaning them the moment I got back inside. Tank was forcing me to live in the present. The past was too abstract, and the future was too far away. The only thing that mattered was right now. Does Tank need to poop? Is Tank eating something dangerous? Is Tank about to ram his head into the fence post? One evening, about 2 weeks in, I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Tank was curled up on the mat beside me, finally quiet. I had a cup of coffee, and I was actually feeling a moment of something close to peace. I looked down at him. He was ugly, he was loud, he was gassy, and he was absolutely dependent on me. He needed me to feed him, to protect him from his own clumsiness, and to take him outside. And I realized something terrifying. I was needed. Not in the high-stakes, life-or-death way. I was needed overseas. This was a messy, simple, fundamental need. If I didn't get up tomorrow, Tank would be hungry. He would be trapped. His life, in its ridiculous, snorting glory, was entirely reliant on me functioning. It was the first time since leaving the army that I hadn't actively considered checking out. Because now, if I checked out, who would manage the Pibble Dog's complicated breathing schedule? I reached down and cautiously scratched him behind his enormous ear. He sighed contentedly, deep, shuddering sound, and leaned heavily into my hand. "You're a pain in the neck, Tank," I whispered. He responded by letting out a small, quiet, entirely odorless puff of air. It was a sign of trust. This silly dog, who I had resented and resisted, had somehow breached the walls I had spent years constructing. He hadn't done it with therapy or deep conversations. He had done it with pure, relentless, stinky demand. He simply refused to let me stay invisible. I knew then that I wasn't sending him back to Sarah. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to fight for something that wasn't just my own survival. I was ready to fight for Tank's next meal, his next walk, and his next ridiculously loud snore. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the first step toward fighting for Frank Miller again. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. Tank was asleep on the foot of my bed, which was a breach of another rule I had established and then instantly failed to enforce. I got up, made coffee, and walked straight to the kitchen counter. I picked up the rubber chicken, walked into the living room, and tossed it to him. Wheek went the chicken. Snort went Tank, completely thrilled. I sat down, drank my coffee, and listened to the chaos. It was the best cup of coffee I'd had in years. I knew then that the silence was officially over. And I had a feeling that Tank's arrival wasn't just about saving me, it was about giving me a brand new mission. A mission that started with teaching a clumsy Pibble Dog not to eat every stick he found on the ground. And that, believe me, was a full-time job. Believe me, that squeaky rubber chicken was the sound of my life changing. It wasn't a noble sound. It was an irritating, repetitive squeak. Tweak. Squeak of sheer, ridiculous joy, and I was holding the leash to the source of the chaos. I didn't immediately turn into a cheerful dog owner. I was still Frank Miller, Major Miller, the master of controlled rage and isolation. I just had a new, extremely demanding four-legged parasite. The thing about Tank, the thing that made him a better therapist than Dr. Chen could ever be, was his absolute lack of self-awareness regarding boundaries. He didn't care if I was having a flashback, panic attack, or just trying to enjoy my black coffee in silence. If he needed something, he demanded it. And his demands were physical. If I tried to sit in my chair and stare at the wall, which was my old coping mechanism, Tank wouldn't allow it. He'd jump up, or rather, claw his way up and wedge himself between my chest and the back of the chair. It felt like being hugged by a disgruntled cinder block. I'd try to push him away. Go lie down, Tank. Get off. He would just burrow deeper, letting out a wet, dramatic sigh that vibrated right through my sternum. That sigh usually preceded a heavy, rattling snore that drowned out the internal noise I was fighting. I learned very quickly that the only way to get peace was to meet his needs instantly. If he wanted to go out, I went out. If he wanted to eat, I fed him. My schedule, the rigid, predictable structure I had built to keep the world out, was completely overwritten by Tank's digestive tract and bladder capacity. And because of that, I started sleeping better. Not because the nightmares stopped, they didn't, but because Tank's constant presence was a physical weight, a warm anchor in the dark. If I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced I was back in a dust-filled room overseas, Tank would usually be right there, pressed against my side, wheezing like an old tea kettle. Hearing that absurd living noise pulled me back to Bozeman, Montana, 2018. It reminded me that the only immediate threat was stepping on a squeaky toy in the middle of the night. The walks, which I had dreaded, became mandatory therapy sessions. We had to go out, rain, snow, or shine. If I skipped a walk, Tank would become a furry, flat-faced terrorist inside the house. We started exploring further than just my yard. I tried to stick to the deserted country roads, but Tank had other ideas. He was a curious dog, and his short legs could cover surprising ground when motivated by a particularly interesting scent, usually deer droppings. One afternoon, we ended up near the local park. I hadn't been to a public park in years. Too many people, too many unsecured exits, too much chaos. I immediately tensed up. I wanted to turn around, but Tank had spotted something, a group of kids playing soccer, and he was frozen, staring at the movement with intense, dopey focus. I gripped the leash, ready to bolt. But then a little girl, maybe 6 years old, saw Tank. "Mommy, look, it's a little pig dog." She shrieked and ran right toward us. My training kicked in. Assess threat. Maintain distance. Prepare for contact. The girl's mother, a tired-looking woman with a stroller, rushed over, apologizing profusely. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Lily, come back here." Lily ignored her mother. She skidded to a stop right in front of Tank. Tank, instead of barking or retreating, sat down, leaned his head to the side, and then, inexplicably, let out a tiny, happy oink. Lily burst into giggles. She reached out a hesitant hand, and before I could stop her, she was stroking Tank's velvety ear. Tank responded by doing the one thing he did best. He leaned into the affection, let out a deep snort, and passed gas. It was, thankfully, a milder strain this time, but definitely noticeable. The mother winced, but the little girl just laughed harder, convinced the dog was intentionally making funny noises. He's a friendly one, the mother said, pulling Lily back slightly. What's his name? Tank, I mumbled. Well, Tank is lovely. Don't mind his little noises. She smiled at me, a genuine, unjudgmental smile. It's nice to see you out, Frank. I'm Carol. We live a few blocks over. I managed a full sentence this time. He requires exercise. I didn't say I required the exercise. The exchange lasted maybe 90 seconds. But when they left, I didn't feel the usual spike of adrenaline. I felt normal. Like a normal guy walking his gassy, snorting dog. Tank had taken the attention, absorbed the social awkwardness, and allowed me to be a participant in civilian life without having to lead the charge. He was my social shield. The physical demands of Tank started changing my relationship with my own body, too. Before Tank, exercise was a purely internal discipline, push-ups in the dark, punishing myself with routine. But now, when Tank started wheezing too hard on a walk, I had to pick him up. He was heavy. 30 pounds of dense, solid muscle and bone. Carrying him was a functional lift. I wasn't lifting weights to cope. I was lifting Tank to save him from overheating or tripping over his own feet. I started developing a new kind of alertness. Not hypervigilance for snipers, but vigilance for Tank. Where is he? Is he choking? Is he about to eat that poisonous mushroom? My focus shifted from the external threat of the world to the immediate, clumsy threat Tank posed to himself. About a month into our involuntary partnership, I had to take him to the vet. This was a major event. I hadn't been in a doctor's office waiting room since my last VA torture session. The vet clinic was packed. Dogs barking, cats yowling, people talking on their phones. I instantly felt the walls closing in. I stood pressed against the wall, Tank tucked tightly under my arm, scanning the room for the fastest exit. When the nurse called Tank Miller, I nearly snapped at her for using my name. The vet, a young woman named Dr. Reese, was professional and gentle. She examined Tank, listened to his chest, which sounded like a washing machine full of gravel, and gently explained his chronic skin issues. He's a typical Frenchy Frank, she said, looking at his chart. He's prone to allergies, he's a bit overweight, and his soft palate is probably too long. We need to be careful with heat and strenuous activity. Then she looked at me, noticing my military haircut and my rigid posture. He's a high-maintenance breed, Frank. He needs careful management. But he's clearly very attached to you. I bristled. I'm managing him. I follow the schedule precisely. I can tell, she said, smiling kindly. He's calmer than most Frenchies I see. You've given him structure. Then she pointed to a small, inflamed patch on Tank's paw. This looks like an allergic reaction to grass pollen. We need to start him on a specific steroid cream, applied twice a day. She handed me the tube. I looked at the complicated instructions. I can handle it, I said, maybe a little too aggressively. What happened next was unexpected. As Dr. Reese reached out to give Tank a pat, another dog, a nervous terrier in the next exam room, let out a sudden, sharp, high-pitched bark. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. In that instant, my body reacted before my brain. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. I just moved. I immediately scooped Tank up, turned my body away from the door, creating a shield, and stood ready. My focus was entirely on protecting the small, vulnerable creature in my arms. Dr. Reese froze, startled by my sudden, aggressive posture. It took me a full 5 seconds to register that the threat was just a nervous terrier. I slowly lowered Tank, feeling my heart rate finally begin to decelerate from 180. Dr. Reese didn't comment on the jump. She just looked at Tank, who was now giving her a look of profound confusion. Well, Frank, she said softly, gathering her composure. It's clear you're doing a great job protecting him. Keep applying that structure. It's exactly what he needs. Walking out of that clinic, I felt shaken, but not by the usual terror. I was shaken by the realization that my protective instincts, the ones that had been driving me insane through hypervigilance, hadn't vanished. They had just found a new, safe, and necessary target. Tank. I wasn't protecting myself from the world anymore. I was protecting Tank from the world and from himself. This was the pivot point. I realized that my highly specialized training, my discipline, my focus, my ability to create and adhere to a rigid schedule was actually valuable, even here in civilian life. It wasn't useless. It just needed a new application. Tank was the recipient of my structure, but he was also the least disciplined creature on the planet. I tried to teach him basic commands. Tank, sit. Tank would usually respond by lying down, rolling over, and exposing his belly, demanding a rub. Tank, stay. Tank would stay for exactly the length of time it took for me to turn my back, and then he would be gone, usually trying to steal a sock. It was frustrating, but it was a frustration I could manage. It wasn't life or death. It was just a profoundly silly dog. But the process of trying to train him, the repetition, a patience, a clear communication, it felt familiar. It felt like work I was good at. One evening, while Tank was asleep on the couch, snoring loud enough to rattle the windows, I was looking through some old papers. I found a certificate from the Army's K9 handler course I'd taken years ago, back when I was still climbing the ranks. I looked at the certificate, then at Tank, the least military dog imaginable. I suddenly had a thought so loud it cut through Tank's snoring. If I can't train him, maybe I can train the right dogs. I thought about the other guys I had seen at the VA. The ones who look just like me, ghosts waiting for the clock to run out. I knew the statistics. A service dog could drastically reduce symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and social isolation. I had the knowledge. I had the discipline. And now, thanks to Tank, I had a compelling reason to leave the house and talk to people. The next time Sarah called, I answered on the first ring. Frank, are you okay? You sound energized. I'm fine, Sarah. Tank needs a specific kind of hypoallergenic treat, and I need to find a supplier that ships to Bozeman fast, because he's running low, and if he runs low, he gets grumpy. She laughed. You're talking about dog food, Frank. That's amazing. Yeah, well, listen. I have a question. Do you know anything about service dog training organizations in Montana? There was a pause on the line. A long, silent pause that usually meant Sarah was about to cry tears of relief. Frank, are you serious? I'm serious. I'm thinking about volunteering. Or maybe even getting certified again. Using my training. Not just to train the dogs, but to help match them with veterans. I know what they're going through. I know the isolation. I paused. And I know what it takes to break it. I looked down at Tank. It takes a lot of noise and flatulence. Sarah was ecstatic. She immediately started rattling off names and phone numbers. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. She found me the name of a highly respected organization based near Missoula, called Patriot Paws Montana. My next appointment with Dr. Chen came up a week later. I showed up on time, and this time I didn't press myself against the wall. I sat in the chair and I didn't mute the humming of the fluorescent lights. I had bigger, louder sounds to worry about now. Dr. Chen looked at my chart, then looked up at me. He was clearly trying to hide his surprise. Frank, he said, leaning forward. You seem better. Your heart rate is lower. You're making eye contact. And I notice a distinct scent of beef jerky and dog hair. I shrugged, a genuine relaxed shrug this time. That would be Tank. He sheds like a monster and he thinks he deserves my beef jerky. And how is the routine going? It's Tank's routine now, I corrected him. He forces me to walk 4 miles a day total. He forces me to be punctual. He forces me to interact with strangers who want to pet him. He's a logistical nightmare, doctor. But he's effective. I told him about the protective instinct at the vet clinic. I told him about Lily, the little girl at the park. I told him about the sudden, terrifying thought of purpose. Dr. Chen listened patiently, nodding. Frank, you came in here looking for silence. You got chaos. And that chaos seems to have been the key. I'm looking into training service dogs now, I said, laying out the idea of Patriot Paws Montana. I want to use my K9 skills. I want to help other guys who are stuck in the dark. Dr. Chen leaned back, smiling widely. Frank, that is excellent. You found a way to externalize your discipline and your protective drive. You're not just coping, you're building a bridge back to the world. He gave me a referral and a huge stack of paperwork, assuring me that this was exactly the kind of re-engagement the VA fully supported. Leaving the VA clinic that day, I felt lighter than I had in a decade. I wasn't running away from the future. I was running toward a new job. The very next week, I made the drive down to Missoula to meet with the founders of Patriot Paws Montana. I left Tank at home, though it felt strange to walk out the door without his wheezing presence beside me. It was the first time I had felt truly alone since he arrived, and the silence of my truck felt deafening. Patriot Paws was run out of a large, renovated barn on a beautiful, sprawling ranch outside of town. When I walked in, it was structured, busy, and full of purpose. It smelled like clean dog and leather. I met with the director, a woman named Kelly, who was a former military spouse. She knew my file, she knew the drill, and she didn't mince words. Major Miller, we need trainers who understand the trauma. You can spot the difference between a dog that's reacting to a firecracker and a dog that's reacting to a panic attack. I looked around the facility. There were several young dogs, mostly Labradors and Golden Retrievers, big, smart, focused animals going through drills. They were learning to retrieve objects, to brace for falls, and most importantly, to interrupt anxiety cycles. Watching those dogs work, I saw the kind of discipline I understood. It was military precision applied to healing. It was beautiful. I can do the training, I told Kelly, my voice firm. I just need to know where to start. She smiled. We start with an observation period. We need to see how you interact with the dogs. And we need to make sure you're ready for the long hours and the emotional investment. I spent the next 3 days observing the training. It was rigorous. I watched them teach a lab named Shadow how to recognize the early signs of a night terror and wake its handler gently. I watched them teach a golden named Max how to stand between a veteran and a crowd in a store, creating a personal bubble of space. It was focused work. It was meaningful. It was everything my life hadn't been. When I drove back to Bozeman, I wasn't just bringing home a dog, I was bringing home a mission. I called Kelly the moment I got back. I'm in, I said. Tell me where I start. She outlined the certification process. I'd start as a volunteer apprentice, focusing on basic obedience and socialization. It meant 2 full days a week driving down to Missoula, and then working the dogs at home, if I was approved for fostering. It meant leaving my house, interacting with people, and submitting to a demanding schedule. The old Frank Miller would have panicked and retreated, but the new Frank Miller, the one who smelled faintly of beef jerky and was constantly worried about Tank's skin allergies, was ready. I got home late that night. I opened the door and Tank was waiting for me. He hadn't been fed dinner yet. Sarah had promised to come over, but I guess she got delayed. Tank was standing by his empty food bowl, looking profoundly betrayed. He let out a low, guttural whine that sounded like a motorboat struggling to start. I know, I said, dropping my bag and rushing to the cabinet. You're starving. The logistics were compromised. As I scooped the expensive kibble into his bowl, Tank was vibrating with excitement. He ate the whole thing in about 30 seconds, snorting and gulping, barely chewing. When he was done, he looked up at me, his eyes wide, and then let out a massive, chest-rattling burp. I just shook my head and smiled. A real smile. You, Tank, I said, scratching his head. You are the anti-service dog. You are a distraction dog. But he was my anchor. He was the reason I was now driving 100 miles a week, talking to strangers, and planning a future that didn't involve staring at a wall. The next day, the real work began. I started Tank's training in earnest. Not to turn him into a service dog that was a lost cause, but to rehone my own skills. I started taking him to the local dog park, forcing myself into high-stress social situations. I'd stand on the edge of the park, leash in hand, and practice ignoring the noise and the crowds. Tank, meanwhile, would be running around like a clumsy bowling ball, aching friends and leaving a trail of flatulence. One day, I was standing there, watching Tank try to play with a massive Rottweiler. The Rottweiler was clearly confused by Tank's inability to grasp personal space when Susan, the neighbor from up the road, walked up. Frank, Tank is just the sweetest thing, she said. He's certainly getting you out of the house. We see you walking every morning now. I nodded. He's insistent. Well, it's good to have you in the neighborhood, Frank. We're having a block barbecue next weekend. You should come. Bring Tank. My heart did a quick, familiar stutter. A party. Unstructured social time. My brain screamed no. But then I looked at Tank, who was now trotting back over, his tongue lolling out, looking completely happy and oblivious. If I went, I wouldn't have to talk much. I could just stand there, holding Tank's leash, using him as the conversational magnet. He was the perfect excuse. I looked at Susan. I'll consider it, I said. That was the biggest step of all. Not just leaving the house, but willingly stepping into an environment I had spent years avoiding. I knew the process of healing was going to be long and messy. But now I had a purpose bigger than just surviving. I had a mission to train dogs that could pull other veterans out of the isolation I knew so well. And it all started with a goofy Pibble Dog who hated crates, loved squeaky chickens, and smelled terrible. I had found my way back to life, one snort and one stinky cloud at a time. I was ready to start training. Not just the dogs, but myself. The decision to join Patriot Paws Montana wasn't just a career change, it was a surrender. I was surrendering my isolation, my silence, and my carefully constructed wall of nothingness to a new kind of chaos. Structured chaos this time. Kelly, the director at PPM, was sharp. She saw the military bearing under the sweatpants. She didn't want a therapist, she wanted a disciplined mind that understood mission parameters. The training was exactly what I needed. It was rigorous, exacting, and required absolute focus. My first task was basic obedience and socialization for a litter of 8-week-old Labrador puppies. 8 puppies. It was pandemonium. But it was fun pandemonium. I excelled at the drills. My decades of teaching recruits how to execute complex maneuvers translated perfectly into teaching a lab puppy named Shadow how to sit and stay under duress. I found myself using my old command voice, sharp, clear, and non-negotiable, and the dogs responded instantly. They craved that structure. The contrast between my work dogs and my home dog was profound. At the PPM facility in Missoula, I was Major Miller again, demanding perfection from Shadow and Max. They were elegant, focused, and silent, moving with the kind of precision I admired. Then I'd drive back to Bozeman, open the door, and be greeted by Tank. Tank was still the anti-discipline dog. He was chaos in a blue harness. He still refused to walk in a straight line, still ate pinecones, and still used his flatulence as a form of territorial marking. I tried to apply my new training techniques to him. Tank, heel. I'd command, demonstrating the proper leash hold with the precision I taught the labs. Tank would take 2 proper steps and stop, sit down, and start aggressively scratching his ear, ignoring me completely. He was a constant, wheezing reminder that life wasn't always about perfection. Sometimes it was just about surviving the next 5 minutes without stepping in dog vomit. But Tank was my decompression chamber. After a long, emotionally heavy day of training a dog to pull a veteran out of a flashback, I needed Tank's absurdity. When I was dealing with the weight of other people's trauma, Tank would demand a belly rub, and the sheer physical necessity of rubbing his thick, warm belly pulled me instantly back to the simple, ridiculous present. The walks, however, started changing. Tank's insistence on walking, combined with my new commitment to socialization for the PPM dogs, meant I was out in the community constantly. The isolation was impossible to maintain. I started taking Tank to the local coffee shop drive-thru. Not for coffee, but because the barista always gave him a dollop of whipped cream, a pup cup. Tank loved the pup cups, and the ritual forced me to engage in a brief, pleasant interaction with a stranger every morning. "Good morning, Frank. How's the little steam engine doing today?" The barista, Maya, would ask, laughing at Tank's snorting anticipation. "He's stable, Maya. Demanding but stable." Those small interactions built up. They were like exposure therapy, but instead of facing my fears alone, I had a 30-pound, flat-faced distraction absorbing the social pressure. People weren't looking at the tense, isolated veteran. They were looking at the dog that looked like a grumpy potato. A few months into my apprenticeship, Kelly gave me my first major responsibility, fostering a full-time service dog in training. "Frank, beat Delta," Kelly said, handing me the leash of a calm, beautiful 2-year-old golden retriever. "She's 6 months away from placement. She needs to master public access and advanced task training. You'll be responsible for her 24/7. Bringing Delta home was a logistical marvel. My house, which had been a minimalist bunker, now resembled a high-end dog kennel. Delta was perfect. She understood commands, she was quiet, and she never ever passed gas. Tank, however, was immediately suspicious. He saw Delta as a threat to his dominance, which was purely imaginary, as Tank couldn't dominate a tennis ball. He would stand in the middle of the living room, let out a series of pathetic, challenging snorts, and then try to block Delta from getting to the water bowl. Delta, the professional, handled it with serene patience. If Tank tried to wedge himself onto my lap, Delta would simply lie at my feet, placing her head gently on my boot, a silent, stabilizing weight. My routine now involved juggling 2 dogs, the precision training of Delta, and the constant management of Tank's self-destructive tendencies. It was Delta's presence that finally forced me to accept Susan's invitation to the block barbecue. The thought of going still made my palms sweat, but I told myself it was mandatory socialization for Delta. "We are going to the perimeter, Delta," I muttered, clipping her PPM vest onto her. "Maintain focus. Ignore distractions." I put Tank in his bright blue harness, the one that screamed pet, not professional, and attached his leash. We walked over to Susan's house. The noise was overwhelming. Laughter, music, kids screaming, the smell of charcoal and cheap hot dogs. I immediately positioned myself by the fence, my back against the wood, Delta sitting perfectly at my side, creating a physical barrier between me and the crowd. People approached, but not me. They approached Delta. "Oh, is she a service dog?" a woman asked gently. "In training," I replied, my voice steady. "Patriot Paws, Montana." This opened a safe avenue of conversation. People weren't asking about my service or my trauma, they were asking about Delta's training, her tasks, and the mission of PPM. I could talk about this for hours. It was objective. It was safe. Meanwhile, Hank was doing his job as the lovable distraction. He was waddling around, sniffing the grill, attempting to steal a rogue potato chip, and generally being the comic relief. A group of kids quickly surrounded Tank. He loved it. He would sit, allow the kids to pet him relentlessly, and reward them with loud, dramatic snorts. He was the perfect icebreaker. I realized that night that Tank and Delta were two sides of the same coin. One represented discipline and healing, the other represented the messy, necessary joy of living. Together they were forcing me into the world. The months flew by. I became a fixture at PPM. I earned my certification as a service dog trainer, specializing in mobility and PTSD support. I was good at it. I was helping the dogs learn how to save lives, and in doing so I was saving my own. And then came placement day for Delta. The recipient was a young Marine named Marcus, who had been medically discharged after a severe injury and was struggling with the transition back home to Billings. He was quiet, hollow-eyed, and barely spoke, a mirror image of the Frank Miller who had first met Dr. Chin. The match process was delicate. We needed to ensure Delta and Marcus bonded. I sat in the observation room with Kelly, watching the introduction. Marcus was hesitant. He kept his hands in his pockets, his posture rigid. Delta, sensing his anxiety, did exactly what I had trained her to do. She didn't rush him. She walked slowly toward him, sat down exactly 6 inches from his feet, and then gently placed her head on his knee. Marcus looked down at the dog. He didn't flinch away from the contact. He slowly, tentatively reached out a hand. He started petting her, and the rigidity in his shoulders seemed to melt away slightly. She's very calm," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "She knows her job," I murmured to Kelly, watching the scene unfold. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He pulled his hands away, took a deep, shuddering breath, and the familiar signs of an oncoming panic attack began: rapid blinking, shallow breathing, scanning the room. Delta instantly reacted. She nudged his hand with her nose, then stood up and pressed her entire body against his leg, a grounding pressure that demanded his attention. She then gave a soft, focused lick to his wrist, the interruption task. Marcus looked down at the dog, his eyes wide, and then he let out a long, slow breath. The cycle was broken. He knelt down, burying his face in Delta's thick fur. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the tears start to fall. Kelly reached over and touched my arm. "You did that, Frank. You taught her how to save him." Watching that moment, watching the dog I had fostered and trained connect with the soldier I used to be, was the most profound experience of my life. It was better than any medal, any commendation, or any clean extraction. I had facilitated a rescue. I drove back to Bozeman that evening feeling completely run out, but filled with a quiet, solid happiness. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was contributing. I was building a future, not just waiting for the past to claim me. I walked into my house, and the silence was instantly shattered. Thweek! 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 Tank was in the living room, chasing the rubber chicken, doing frantic zoomies. He skidded to a stop when he saw me, the chicken dangling triumphantly from his mouth. He dropped the chicken, ran over, and launched himself at my legs, barking his wheezy, high-pitched demand for attention. I knelt down and scooped him up. He was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of dust and something vaguely rotten. He immediately started licking my face with enthusiastic abandon. "I missed you too, you little menace," I chuckled, setting him down. I looked around the room. The house wasn't immaculate anymore. There were dog toys scattered everywhere, faint patina of Frenchy hair on the rug, and the air was never truly clean. It was noisy, messy, and alive. I poured myself a glass of water and stepped out onto the porch. It was a clear summer evening, the kind Montana is famous for. The air was cool, smelling of pine and distant hay. Tank followed me out, settling down on the mat at my feet. He let out a deep, satisfied sigh, and then the mechanical, rattling snore began. It was the sound of my life now. Not the sound of a threat, but the sound of an unbreakable bond. I sat there listening to the world, the crickets chirping, a distant car, the heavy, wet breathing of the dog beside me. I didn't feel the need to scan the horizon. I didn't feel the need to retreat. I was present. A few years have passed since then. I'm now the lead trainer for the Bozeman satellite location of Patriot Paws, Montana. I work with 3 or 4 dogs at a time, preparing them for their service lives. I mentor new veteran volunteers who are looking for their own bridge back to the world. I still have bad days. The trauma doesn't just vanish. Sometimes the nightmares hit and I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. But now, when that happens, I don't face the dark alone. I feel a heavy weight settle on the bed beside me. A warm, dense body presses against my side, and an incredibly loud, wet snort echoes right next to my ear. Tank. He's still the worst behaved dog I've ever owned, but he is also the most effective piece of therapy I ever received. He taught me that sometimes the only way to silence the internal noise is to introduce a louder, more ridiculous external noise. I never got the silence I thought I needed. Instead, I got noise, chaos, and a purpose that smells faintly of beef jerky and old canned chili. I reach down, scratch Tank behind his oversized ear, and feel the deep, shuddering sigh he gives in response. "Thanks, pal," I whisper into the dark. He responds with a small, contented grunt, and then, just to remind me who's really in charge, he lets out a quiet, entirely unnecessary puff of gas. And Frank Miller, the former major who was ready to give up on life, just laughs, shakes his head, and prepares for the noisy, messy, wonderful day ahead. The mission continues. And it all started with a goofy, snorting Pibble Dog named Tank. The minor infractions, the washing machine incident, the skunk were mitigated effectively. The overall environment is exemplary. Mr. Sterling looked at me, a genuine smile finally cracking his professional facade. "Congratulations, Jake. You have successfully completed the 365 days of guardianship, adhering to the spirit and, mostly, the letter of the Bartholomew Protocol. The trust will authorize the immediate transfer of the lump sum payment of $500,000 to your account. $500,000. It was real. I had won. Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. He held up a hand. "Wait. There is one final item in the will, Jake. A codicil that only comes into effect upon the successful completion of the initial term." My heart started thumping again. Was there a final catch? Did I have to take a test on nautical terms from Moby Dick? Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Richard Vance, in his usual eccentric fashion, anticipated that if you succeeded, you would have established a genuine bond with Bartholomew. He also acknowledged that $500,000, while substantial, does not guarantee long-term stability. Sterling adjusted his glasses. The final codicil of the will stipulates that upon successful completion of the first year, Jake Miller is offered the permanent, salaried position of Bartholomew Vance's chief guardian and live-in companion. I stared at him. Salaried? Yes. The salary is $150,000 per year, plus full benefits, use of the estate, coverage of all living expenses, and a generous annual bonus based on Bartholomew's continued contentment score. You would, essentially, be employed for life, or for the duration of Bartholomew's life, whichever comes first. Henderson looked like he was going to faint from shock. $150,000 a year to live in a mansion, and take care of a dog I now genuinely liked. You would retain the $500,000 lump sum regardless, Sterling added. You are free to walk away, take the money, and return to Queens. Or you can accept the position and guarantee a lifetime of financial security, provided Bartholomew remains happy. I looked down at the dog. Bartholomew was watching me, his breathing shallow. He seemed to understand the gravity of the decision. I thought about Queens, the moldy apartment, the aggressive mountain of bills, the constant, grinding anxiety. I thought about the studio above the garage, the smell of fresh paint, the quiet nights, and the fact that I hadn't eaten generic saltines in a year. I thought about Uncle Richard's final note: if you can learn to put Bartholomew's needs above your own for just 1 year, you will learn more about true wealth than any stock portfolio could teach you. True wealth wasn't just $500,000. True wealth was stability, security, and having a purpose, even if that purpose was ensuring a Pibble Dog's bison was medium rare. "Mr. Sterling," I said, slow grin spreading across my face. "I accept the position." Sterling smiled widely, a real, genuine smile this time. "Excellent, Jake. Richard will be pleased." Bartholomew, apparently sensing the positive outcome, let out a joyous, celebratory snort and started licking my hand enthusiastically. Henderson cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Miller, I must remind you, the terms of the protocol remain in effect, regardless of your employment status. I know, Henderson, I said, standing up, feeling taller than I had in years. But I've got a slight amendment to Rule 4 for the entertainment hour. Henderson raised a skeptical eyebrow. An amendment? That is highly irregular. From now on, I announced, picking up Bartholomew and holding him against my shoulder, we're taking a break from Moby Dick. We've finished it. I think Bartholomew is ready for some Mark Twain. Maybe a little Tom Sawyer. Bartholomew gave a soft, pleased whine, snuggling into my neck. Henderson sighed, pulling a tiny gold-plated notepad from his tuxedo pocket. Very well, Mr. Miller. Tom Sawyer. I shall make a note for the next review. The panel left, and I was finally truly alone with Bartholomew. I walked us out onto the sprawling lawn, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the immaculate green. I set Bartholomew down, and he immediately started rooting around in the grass, enjoying his post-assessment freedom. I had come to Vance Manor a desperate, broke nephew, hoping to steal a fortune. I left the year with $500,000, a six-figure salary, a mansion, and a renewed sense of purpose. I hadn't inherited the $10 million, but I had inherited a life. I watched Bartholomew trot happily across the grass in his little tweed coat, a small, ridiculous monarch in his vast kingdom. Don't worry, buddy, I called out to him, laughing. I'm not going anywhere. We still have a lifetime of medium-rare bison and classic American literature ahead of us. Bartholomew stopped, looked back at me, and let out a single, perfectly timed snort, the sound of a dog who knew he was loved, respected, and whose life was going to continue in exactly the level of pampered luxury he deserved. And that, I realized, was the true definition of a successful year.